So Jessica Wilkinson, I am with the Nature Conservancy. I'll be your moderator for this session. I work for the Nature Conservancy's mothership, which is in Virginia, outside of DC, and I'm our North America Renewable Energy Team Lead. I've worked on mitigation and compensatory mitigation for over 25 years, and there's some folks in the room that I know from the world of mitigation for a long time, which is really great to see. I've gone deep on mitigation, on different mechanisms for delivering offsets, mitigation banking, in lieu fee mitigation, permitting responsible mitigation, and all sorts of other interesting schemes that have been introduced over the years. And I've covered topics from compensating for impacts to endangered species, to wetlands and streams, to coral reefs, to migratory birds generally, to eagles, sage-grouse, and lesser prairie chickens specifically, to biodiversity generally, and for impacts to public lands. I'm not the only person in this room that's got that level of expertise and has worked on that full range of issues. And I and many other people in this room have also worked on mitigation that is mandatory, so mitigation that is imposed through regulation in exchange for a permit, mitigation that comes about after the fact to address chemical spills or oil spills, and voluntary mitigation programs, and what can be characterized as ill-defined mitigation programs. I and my colleague Bruce McKenney, who's not here, have published high-level mitigation principles that have been shared widely and translated into Spanish. And I've done workshops for the governments of Colombia, the country, and Mongolia, the country, not the Chinese territory. I call this out to emphasize that this stuff is complicated. It isn't figured out overnight, and aligning an entire industry and related interest groups over how to design and implement mitigation programs is challenging. Kudos to you all for coming together and rising to this occasion. I am going to take, these are the mitigation principles in Mongolian. I'm going to take just a moment to ground the conversation by going back to the basics, what, at its essence, the mitigation hierarchy is. So consider this blue line to be the current status or value, if you will, of biodiversity or other natural resources in a specific area prior to an impact. This is the impact under consideration that is leading to a loss of natural resource values. The mitigation hierarchy is the structured decision-making process that is used to attempt to remedy this loss. What I'm going to show you is similar to the depiction that many, many other people have developed and shared, institutions from UN to some of the groups like the Biodiversity group that is going to be on the phone here with us today. And I assure you that my graphics do not measure up to many of the other kind of versions of this that you will see. Not my strength. So we have the impact that is proposed in this case, and the first step in the mitigation hierarchy is to avoid the impact altogether or some portion of the impact to lessen the blow. Next, we seek to minimize the impacts through how the project is designed or operated. And as you can see, at each step, the residual impacts are reduced. Finally, we seek to address the residual impacts that remain after avoidance and minimization efforts have been fully tapped out. And we do this providing offsets that yield replacement resources. How much of an offset is needed depends on the goal you have set for the program or for the project. If your goal is no net loss, the amount of offset needs to bring you back to the amount of resource prior to the impact. If your goal is net gain or net positive impact, then you need to go above and beyond no net loss. How much above and beyond is needed to get to net positive? A lot of time, I assure you, can be spent debating this issue alone. To have a functioning, effective, and efficient mitigation program, there are 12 components that we've identified. Several are more management decisions, I would argue, than others. But what I want to really emphasize here is that science has a significant role to play in about, I would argue, 7 of them. And again, some of these other ones really are policy decisions or management decisions. So again, mitigation can be complicated, but I would posit that if we can translate it into Mongolian, that we can translate it into ocean. And I think that this panel is the right group of people to do it. So today we have, and we're mostly going in alphabetical order here, Melanie Austen, who is professor of ocean and society at the University of Plymouth in the UK, where she is also director of its Center for Systems Thinking, Ocean, Land, and Society. Aisling Lannin is head of scientific evidence and evaluation at the UK Marine Management Organization. Dr. Sarah Cooley is the director of climate science at Ocean Conservancy. Aspen Ellis is a PhD student and NOAA scholar focusing on seabird conservation in the UC Santa Cruz Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Fletcher is a senior principal consultant and renewables lead at the Biodiversity Consultancy, and she's joining us virtually. And Kate Williams is the director of the Center for Research on Offshore Wind and the Environment at the Biodiversity Research Institute in Maine. Also joining us virtually is Neil Cousins, who is the founder and director of Bluedot Associates, a marine biodiversity consultancy. We have 7 speakers and not a ton of time. We really want to be able to give them an opportunity to ask questions of each other and ask some questions from the room. So we've asked them to stick to 8 minutes each, more or less, although Aisling and Mel are tag teaming it, so we give them a little flexibility there. With that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Aisling. And you have slides, yes. Oh. There we go. They just did it magically.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks especially for inviting me to come and talk to you today. That's really a great pleasure. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about this paper that Mel and I wrote with our colleague Tara Hooper, and that was published last year. But I want to say categorically, this is not English government policy. This is just a collection of our combined experience and expertise and an analysis over quite a while. The forward one. Just before I go into the conclusions, you're telling me what we're talking about conclusions already. That's a bit mental, but sometimes that's how we like to do it. But one of the things that I really want to say is that this is kind of a historical moment, and it's moving really fast, and it's going to be very hard for us to actually grab onto it. It might just pass us by. The proliferation of offshore wind and the kind of general consensus that we should be restoring biodiversity and trying to do something about the climate, it's all happening at the same time very quickly. So we have a moment. This symposium is very timely for that. So it's good to try and grab that moment. But in grabbing the moment, it's quite often sensible to take a little step back and think about the bigger picture and figure out together what is it that we really want out of this in the end? What are the outcomes? And yeah, we can get into the detail, but let's be clear about the bigger picture first, and then we can figure out how to navigate to that point. So, conclusions first. That's so that people who need to nap don't need to listen to the rest of this. We think that net gain needs a system approach with site-based solutions fitting into a much bigger sociological structure. It's just part of it. It's just a bit of something that needs to be enormous and needs all of us with all of our different ways and means getting together on that. We think in particular that net gain has a lot of challenges in terms of implementation. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but there's just so many challenges there, and they range from the lack of data and some of the governance issues that were talked about earlier on. And although I'm a scientist, a natural scientist, a fisheries scientist, I would say let's not entirely and totally get bogged down in the data side of it, because I actually think that the decision-making framework is the more important thing to concentrate on right now. Because beautiful data, wonderful data that we really love, and the analysis is stupendous, it's ongoing. It happens all the time. We're going to be doing it forever. So we need to try and, we need to try and get the structure correct insofar as we can. And that's just, this isn't a throwaway, but I'm just going to say that widespread marine net gain cannot occur independently of fisheries management, or in fact management of any other sector. It's hard. I'm not saying that's easy, but we really need to think about it in that way. So, some general lessons from the UK. There we go. The challenge of progressing to net gain should not be underestimated. I'm not saying don't be positive, don't be hopeful, but just some realism. First of all, the mitigation hierarchy is not always followed. So we're trying to build on something that it doesn't always happen, which is quite hard. There are very few marine examples of net gain, and the measures for net gain tend to be limited to a subset of species and specific protected features, which we all know this is an ecosystem. It's a system, isn't it? If we just concentrate on bits of it, then we're just going to get bits out of it in the end. So it's not going to give us what we really, really in our hearts want. And there is, as we see it, certainly when we were writing this paper, little evidence of monitoring and evaluation and knowledge that actually what's already happening is doing the job. And lastly, but really in my mind most fundamentally, and I think this came up quite a bit in the panel earlier, though I have to admit that some of the language used is so different to the way we talk about it in our part of the world that it took me a while to lock into it. But I think we're saying a similar thing, but essentially that the counterfactuals are not clearly defined. And counterfactuals, by saying that, what I mean is that both the baselines, and that's a tricky thing, which the panel talked about, but also the scenarios of the possible outcomes, because nothing ever goes in a straight line, does it? Nothing ever comes out exactly the way we expected it. And I think we need to think about all of those scenarios. So, net gain, as we know it, certainly, came from a land-based idea. And the major point that I really want to make here is that it's sort of been applied in some instances on land. We're not quite sure how well that is doing, and now we want to apply net gain at sea, even though we're not quite sure how it's doing in that other space. And actually, I think we know. The sea is quite different. It's a totally different situation. And it's different for mobile species, it is different for habitats, and what we want out of it and what it does for us is different. So yeah, so maybe just some thought, just let's think a little bit about if it's the best thing to just grab this thing off the shelf and just try and apply it over here. So, and just a little bit about metrics. They're practical, they're good, we like numbers, they quantify, it's helpful. You know, you can write those down and everybody knows what they look like, and that's good. But numbers don't always tell the story, the whole story. So there's a thing about whether something that's just going to quantify is actually going to give us what we need. And also that using metrics might actually just obscure the beautiful, gorgeous complexity of the oceans that we are really interested in and that we might not know is so important to us just yet. So there's something about not creating something massively complicated and forgetting that actually it's not complication we want, it's a complex approach. It's something that we can get through, but that envelops all that complexity. Yeah, so and just a query if having a metric is even the best way to quantify, and who knows. We have some opinions, but we're not going to talk about them right now. And while I've mentioned mobile species already, and well, I think you get it, don't you? I mean, if we're talking about trying to do something about mobile species, then something that's really locked down in terms of habitats is not going to give us quite what we would want. So, and there are alternatives proposed. That's great. We like all the options, the ideas, but they're untested. And I think testing is something we have to really focus on. Not testing in a decade, when, by the way, our esteemed climate change colleagues will have told us already we're past the point. But testing now and taking some risks about that testing and just getting right into the actual, the real, the functional, the practical right now. I'm a fan of regulatory sandboxes where you can get a dispensation to do something a bit wacky and wild, just so that we can all together collectively see whether that's working or not. So, and testing the metric, testing a metric in England, which has been done, threw up a lot of things, which actually the panel were talking about earlier as well. Like mainly, if you don't have the baseline, then how do you know whether or not you're actually making a difference to what you're doing? And our baseline data, often for the sea, because it's very hard to collect, is not that great. And so we kind of, we have, certainly in England, we have very little confidence in our habitat maps. So that makes it really hard. And there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of things that actually could make this really, really hard in the long term. And do we have time for that? Also, in some ways, there's like a distributional effect of burden. And I think it would be really nice if we could do this collectively and together, rather than a particular sector having to take the burden of dealing with all of this. So do we need to think about a different approach?
Come to me. Okay. Right. So as Aisling says, we've got this metric which is applied on land. We're not terrifically impressed with it. What can we do differently? One way, the burden at the moment is currently on the developer to get on and do this. And at least initially, we do feel quite strongly that payments-based approaches, where they basically, and I think you just call it in lieu payments or something like that, there's a different word over here, but basically getting the developers to pay into a fund to actually sort of start to develop wider, broader mitigation procedures, at least initially, might be a better way to go through. It's widely used globally, and it's a bit less complicated than trying to use ecological equivalence metrics, which we've seen that they're already complex to do on land, where you can actually see the stuff that you're monitoring and you're trying to manipulate, let alone in the marine environment where you can't see it. So it's something that at least gets us started, I think. And also, you know, the governance and links to actual strategic outcomes, and you'll hear that we're starting to think strategically about what net gain looks like, not site by site, and you saw that in the introduction. And for the marine developers, they might actually prefer not to have to do this stuff on site. They might prefer to just think about things a bit further away. And there are examples in the UK. We did this for aggregate extraction. There was a big fund. There were problems with the governance of that fund and how it was used. It didn't work that brilliantly, but in this case, the aggregate industry were quite happy, well, not happy, but they were prepared to pay over a percentage to actually create that fund. So there is a precedent there. And there's also a precedent with the Scottish Marine Environment Enhancement Fund. And I think there's also precedent, well, I know there are precedents elsewhere in the world. But how are we actually going to achieve the gains, and what does that actually mean? And we have sort of divided this into active restoration and passive recovery. Active restoration meaning actually doing something to enhance the population of particular species or the habitat or the conditions in which a species can survive. So that can be part of how you actually design the wind farm, and we're going to hear more about that tomorrow. Nature-inclusive design, where you actually encourage biodiversity. It's a different type of biodiversity. It's probably an enhanced type of biodiversity. It won't be the biodiversity that was there on the substrate that you plonked a renewable energy device on. But actually, maybe that's not the problem. If you think about it in a systems-based way, maybe that's not really a problem at all. Habitat restoration, we know lots of examples of habitat restoration. They're mostly inshore, seagrass, salt marsh, shellfish and bivalve reefs, etc. Haven't really got much experience of doing habitat restoration offshore yet. I think that's going to be, and if it's expensive inshore, You can imagine how expensive it's going to be offshore. Which sort of then brings us to passive recovery, removing the pressures, key pressures that are causing environmental damage at the moment, alongside climate change, obviously, is commercial fishing and marine litter. So perhaps we can use some of those things to actually remove those pressures, and I think there's quite a lot of effort going along there. There's effort in terms of marine litter for removing fishing gear that's got left on the seabed or is floating around, and that's great. There's also been proposals to compensate using added resources into beach cleans, which I have to admit I think is completely inappropriate if you're doing an offshore development. But what I think we really want to get to is the bigger system, the environmental versus biodiversity net gain, thinking about how can we improve the environment and who we're improving it for. So we have, as part of our Environment Act, which came into force, I think, in 2021, and has been in development for quite some time. It has a policy behind it, the 25-year Environment Plan, which is to improve the environment, basically, for the next generation within 25 years. And that talks very much about expanding the net gain approach, particularly with regard to terrestrial. But here, you know, it is supposed to apply to marine in the UK, to include the wider natural capital benefits. So, you know, one of my areas of research, you know, I'm a professor of ocean and society, which kind of says it all, that I don't actually sit in any pigeonhole. But if I sit in a pigeonhole, it's probably natural capital and ecosystem services in the marine environment. And I think there's so much more we can get from the marine environment. And I've put the three sort of circles there. We want to improve biodiversity. We have a biodiversity crisis. We have a climate crisis, and we can address those. We also want sustainable outcomes and sustainable growth. And, you know, the offshore wind industry sits firmly in that area and can do. So we should be looking for that environmental net gain that also is part of the socio-ecological system, i.e. environmental net gain for people, as well as for the biodiversity in its own right. And for the biodiversity in its own right, because actually people care about biodiversity. Most of us do care about biodiversity. So we need to start thinking about this bigger picture benefits that we get and should be getting from the biodiversity, without losing sight of the fact that that is underpinned by biodiversity. So environmental versus net gain based on the site-specific biodiversity alone, we don't think is going to offer the bigger ecological benefits that we could get from this huge rapid development of offshore wind. I think there are benefits to be gained, not just in mitigating climate change, but also in terms of improving the biodiversity, improving the habitats, improving the ecosystem services. But we've got to be thinking about that bigger picture rather than a site-by-site, biodiversity perspective. So we need a framework that includes both the sociological data, the social approaches, the ecosystem service implications, so that we can actually improve social equity. We are going to have impacts on the fishing industry. We are going to have impacts on a lot of different sectors. We need to try and make sure that that lands equitably amongst all of the communities that are affected. Because there are, and we want to make sure that we also provide wider benefits to the wider communities. There is equity in there. We need a forward-looking perspective that considers not only the growing demand for energy, for biodiversity, for addressing climate change, but also takes into account climate change itself, because, you know, we can mitigate as much as we like, we can do biodiversity and net gain as much as we like, but we've also got to think about how is climate change going to affect that. We have to take a bigger forward-looking approach. If we go down the metric route with natural capital ecosystem services, this environmental approach, it's going to be even more challenging. It's doable. I mean, we are getting better at doing ecosystem assessments, natural capital assessments, ecosystem service assessments, benefits assessments. It's hugely time-consuming and resource-intensive, and we still suffer from the same problems that you've talked about already about baselines. But it is doable if that's what we really need. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that underpinning this, there are the biodiversity priorities. That's still hugely important. So isolated site-based approaches are likely to be limited. And they're also not necessarily cost-effective. If you think in a more integrated way, you're going to get more back for the investment that we want the offshore wind industry and the publics and the governments to make at the moment. We need more connection between these sort of larger scale strategic thinking across larger seas. In the North Sea, I think Sharon was saying, you know, just in the Dutch part, it's, I think, 5,000 wind farms about to go, wind turbines about to go out. That's huge. We need a bigger assessment of what's going on across the North Sea, across our national areas, across the bigger areas. We've got to think big, but you've got to link that big thinking with the decisions that are made at a local scale for the actual site-specific decisions. The licensing decisions have to be part of that bigger picture thinking. And we need to be a bit flexible. We talked earlier about being adaptive, about the fact that we're in this giant experiment, climate change, biodiversity change, and chucking a load of offshore wind farms in the water. So massive experimentation. We've got to be a bit flexible about how we actually try to mitigate that, try to develop that, adapt, learn. That means we need a huge amount of monitoring and evaluation to continue alongside this. So back to the conclusions again, not convinced about the metrics. So now you can see why we put these conclusions up at the beginning. You know, basically the key ones were the ones that Aisling put up first, which is that we do need this systems-based approach. We need to think about this in a socio-ecological structure, not just in a biodiversity or an ecology or a social system, but actually all three of them, all of it joined together. There's going to be challenges because of a lack of data, we know that, but also the lack of governance frameworks that allow this. Almost in a way, you know, Aisling works for a government agency, I'm on the board of a couple of government agencies, and we're all going like, I'm not sure we're really doing this right at the moment. We need bigger picture thinking. We need to sort of be more ambitious, but we need to embrace the fact that change is happening, and it could be for the better, or it could be positive. At coffee time, you know, take-home message, get the stuff in the water, but monitor and evaluate it and think about how to do it better as quickly as we can and keep going with it. So I think I'll leave it there. Fisheries management, yeah, it's got to be part of it.
I'm Sarah Cooley. I'm the Director of Climate Science at Ocean Conservancy. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty new to the offshore wind space, but I know some stuff about climate impacts. So I'll talk about how these things intersect a little bit. I'll talk to you today a little bit about the Global Biodiversity Framework and how it relates to other global goals, biodiversity in the marine environment broadly, and how can we start thinking about what biodiversity positive truly is in the marine environment relative to offshore wind. So first, the Global Biodiversity Framework. The United Nations Biodiversity Conference in COP15 in Canada this last December ended with a landmark agreement that's supposed to guide global action on nature on through to 2030. And this Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework aims to address biodiversity loss. It aims to restore ecosystems and protect indigenous rights. And there's 4 overarching global goals to protect nature. And they include things like halting human-induced extinction of threatened species and reducing the rate of extinction of all species tenfold by 2050. Sustainably using and managing our biodiversity so that nature's contributions to people are valued and maintained and enhanced. It also focuses on fair sharing of the benefits from the use of genetic resources. That's kind of a new advance. And digital sequencing information on genetic resources. And then finally, means of implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework be accessible to all parties, particularly least developed countries and small island developing states. And then there's a whole raft of specific targets. There's 23 of them. And they focus on some quantitative metrics like managing at least 30% of the world's land, coastal areas, and oceans, restoring 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems, near zero loss of areas of high biodiversity, and then reductions of wastage, food waste, reduction of subsidies that harm biodiversity, increasing funding for biodiversity protection, and really requiring businesses to transparently disclose biodiversity impacts. So it's awesome that we're having this conversation that includes industry here about biodiversity. So the Global Biodiversity Framework relates to other big climate and development goals. All of these things are mutually reinforcing. So in 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity, or IPBES, released the first global assessment of the state of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this identified that rates of biodiversity decline, which are accelerating, compromise our ability to achieve international goals, including Aichi biodiversity targets and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, especially those related to poverty, hunger, health, water, cities, climate, oceans, and land, pretty much the whole basket. Then in 2021, IPBES and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, held a joint workshop, and they concluded limiting global warming to ensure a habitable climate and protecting biodiversity are mutually supporting goals, and their achievement is essential for sustainably and equitably providing benefits to people. You hear that? They're connected. And then in 2022, the IPCC produced a report which assessed climate impacts and solutions, including both adaptation and mitigation solutions. I was the co-chapter lead author for Oceans, Impacts and Adaptation. And we found that curbing climate impacts on the ocean by addressing emissions has a positive synergistic effect on other sustainable development goals. So, addressing climate change by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, safeguarding biodiversity, and supporting equitable human development are three legs of a stool. They all support each other. And if we pursue one to the exclusion of the others, the whole system will not proceed the way that we want it to. So now, thinking about the marine environment and biodiversity, we know that expanding low-carbon technologies can't come at the cost of biodiversity, but measuring biodiversity, which is essentially species richness measurements, and relating it to what we really want to know, is the ecosystem functioning as it should, is extremely hard. All of our advances on quantifying biodiversity in the last few decades through innovative techniques still aren't telling us a lot about how the ecosystem is doing on a functional basis, or in a way, think about whether this ecosystem will support further climate action and equitable human development. Biodiversity is just a proxy for how things are going. So I'm so glad we heard from Aisling and Melanie already to tell us a little bit about, we need to be thinking about these other functional issues. And so there's a really sound argument, obviously, for maintaining biodiversity for the benefit of non-humans or humans. Either way, focusing biodiversity as a metric gets us into the position of trying to conduct human activities in a way that is neutral or beneficial to this extraordinarily complex system, which really can't be fully described by quantifying species numbers and taxonomic diversity. So we've been thinking a lot at Ocean Conservancy about what biodiversity positive wind would constitute, or net positive impact. I really like the specific consideration of human positive by one of the panelists that we'll hear from in a moment. As I mentioned, these things are all mutually supportive, and no one global development goal can replace another. So positive social outcomes are important, but they need to be considered separately from positive environmental outcomes. And so considering what net positive would be, it really starts on that foundation of neutral that we've been discussing all day. This is things like using established best practices for facility construction and operation, environmental impact assessments, community consultation, transparency, commitments to long-term monitoring, and then really anticipating and monitoring those cumulative impacts of construction and operation and even decommissioning. And so getting beyond that is like all of that plus. And we need to have measurable new or enhanced ecosystem functions or benefits after offshore wind facilities, plus equal or higher measures of biodiversity at offshore wind facilities. So we need to have everything that's good and then some. So I really like how I've been hearing people saying going above and beyond. Like that's the way we can kind of keep it in our heads. It also means things like co-located restoration efforts. It means thinking about how climate change will affect nearby ecosystems and planning for that in whatever biodiversity efforts you're making in relation to wind development. It also includes things as unlovely as simply supporting research and monitoring near facilities and allowing free access to science and collaboration. It involves things as boring as credibly and transparently evaluating and documenting what you're doing. And it also requires, a decommissioning plan or an end-of-life plan that really considers these factors as well. Now, we've been discussing a lot about, a lot of the details. And I think one of the details that I don't have an answer for today, and I don't think we do in this room, but I'm hoping we can get to one someday, is how can those, any off-site enhancements of biodiversity be meaningfully related to offshore wind facilities? Offsetting is often kind of a feel-good measure that doesn't actually overcome the problem that was created, and it can actually distract from the hard work of truly minimizing impacts to biodiversity. And, it's at best, it's sort of like, trying hard and falling short. At worst, it's greenwashing. We need to be thinking about how tech transfer from low-income nations or entities and private to public entities can play into this. There's a real need for thinking about the whole, as the previous speakers pointed out, and I want to try to zoom out and think about the global whole. And then also, we need to think about the rules of permitting and actually encouraging or encoding these principles. We're still kind of grappling over some very fundamentals around permitting. And so adding this piece in there, it's going to be a big mountain to climb. And then we also need to really think about these methods and standards, and then how do we actually evaluate these ecosystem functions or benefits, and how do we carry those forward? I mean, the previous speakers mentioned, like, maybe numbers isn't the best way, but numbers fits awfully well into our current system of governance and compensation. So we need to be kind of grappling with that too. And then we also need to be thinking about what kind of sensors and monitoring networks are needed or need to be expanded. And, we're hearing a lot about species that maybe we just don't know enough about because they're not red listed yet. How can we pay attention to those things? And then, there's a lot of others, but sort of those are the first things that pop to my head in terms of what we need, and what I'm most aware of. But I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with everyone. Thank you so much.
You're on, Neil.
Okay, hi, hello. I hope everybody can hear me. Just want to start by saying a big thank you to TNC and the Marine Affairs Institute for giving me an opportunity to join this panel remotely. I feel like I'm cheating a little bit. I know a lot of people have traveled a long way to be at the conference today, and apologies I'm not there. I do have a good excuse. I've just come back from the field in Saudi Arabia and need to travel again. But apologies for not being there in person. Hopefully I can contribute from the UK. Could I have the next slide, please? And again, please. Thank you. So first, it'd be great just to touch upon, I guess, some of the things that Aisling and Mel were talking about in terms of where we currently stand with net gain as a principle. From my perspective, net gain for the marine environment or terrestrial environment is not really a new principle. It's something that we've been using and operating against for quite some time, and has been embedded within national policy, but also international safeguard standards that are used to essentially determine whether development should go ahead or not. I guess in some ways it feels new. I think for the offshore wind farm sector, it is new in many ways, simply because of the fact that international safeguard standards and financing may not have been applied to that particular sector due to private financing. And in other ways, it's new in terms of, I guess, thinking about moving away from a site-based consideration, so a project-by-project based consideration, to much more of a system-based approach. But overall, the principle of delivering a net gain and the requirement to deliver a net gain has been embedded within infrastructure development and offshore infrastructure development under certain circumstances for quite some time. And it's always been a challenge. You know, the key finding from that process is that very rarely is it achieved in a way that it's intended. And there are many issues that lead to those challenges, from understanding the baseline to understanding your impacts, to have the metrics to define how you're going to measure your net gain and have the ability to actually undertake some measurement of that net gain. And then also the success of the processes that you undertake within the marine environment are not guaranteed to deliver success, particularly when you're thinking about active restoration. And if you're thinking about passive restoration, the outcomes that you get are a little uncontrollable. You know, they're related to the system that is that plays out and creates a certain outcome. So it's a principle that's been around for a long time, but the answers for delivering a successful net gain outcome is not well established, and I think that's a word of caution for everybody in the room to understand, that there's, you know, this is to deliver a marine net gain is challenging. The way in the framework of the guidance that we kind of deliver against, such as IFC Performance Standard 6, etc., the way of operationalizing a net gain relates to, as Jessica mentioned, the application of the mitigation hierarchy with avoidance, minimization, restoration, kind of reducing the extent of the residual effects, and then kind of determining whether you need to do an offset if there's a significant residual impact, or whether you need to apply an additional conservation action where there isn't a significant residual impact. But they're project based. You know, that's a site-based application of an approach. And as Aisling and Mel were talking about, there's now a movement much more towards system-based approaches, so accumulating those site-based actions. But that kind of needs a bigger structure in place. It needs a bigger framework in place, because developers and offshore wind farm developers, as an example, will need to apply their actions associated with what's happening with their impacts, and then link that to a system-based approach. There is now, in recent times, an emerging emphasis for net positive or net gain to break out of this consideration of just mitigating site-based impacts. And this relates to some of the things that Sarah was talking about in terms of the global biodiversity framework and bending the curve of biodiversity loss, and the idea of organizations being able to deliver more transformative, scaled and ecosystem-based approaches that extend beyond a site-based consideration. But that is a kind of an above and beyond consideration from what has been normal over the last 10 to 20 years in terms of the application of a net gain approach. Next slide, please. Whilst talking about net gain, I don't think we can ignore this new emerging term called nature positive, and this is something that we as an organisation, as a practicing organisation, come across a lot, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there in terms of what nature positive means and how this relates to net positive, and I think it's an important issue to address, which is why I raise it here. In that, there's a move towards consideration of organisations delivering a nature positive approach rather than a net gain approach. And that really doesn't make sense, actually, in terms of what nature positive means. And I think that needs to be clearly understood, so that we don't go down a route of utilising terminology that doesn't actually work to deliver a real outcome. So nature positive is linked to net gain, but it's a different principle. Nature positive was intended as an umbrella goal for the global biodiversity framework. It had a very specific meaning. It didn't quite make it into the GBF, but its intent is within the mission. And it relates to a global, holistic, cumulative goal for halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity from a static baseline in 2020, with a deadline for delivering that recovery, and then bringing in also components of resilience and well-being. An individual organisation cannot be nature positive. An individual organisation can be net positive, it can deliver net gains, can deliver contributions towards being nature positive, but in isolation, related to the definition of what nature positive means, they cannot be nature positive. It's a global, holistic, cumulative goal that we will achieve if all of the contributions merge together to deliver the outcomes that are needed. An organisation may be able to contribute, and there's different ways an organisation can contribute to nature positive, and that's through halting loss, through transformation, or through delivery of a net positive impact. But if delivering a net positive impact, if using a net positive impact to provide a contribution to nature positive, we need to apply some caution. An example would be if we are applying International Finance Corporation PS6, and delivering a net gain requirement is only needed for critical habitat, then if you are delivering a net gain contribution, automatically you would be impacting upon critical habitat, and of course impacting upon critical habitat is not really in the spirit of nature positive. So the spirit of nature positive is mostly about halting loss, providing transformative actions at scale, and it's beyond biodiversity. Sarah spoke about this earlier in terms of the kind of the people components of ensuring that this environmental and social components of delivering net gain. Nature positive is a social ecological principle, whereas in historically, in terms of the approaches that have been applied over the last 10 years, net gain is very much a biodiversity consideration, with social considered as part of the process, but not actually as part of the outcome. So nature positive is a little bit more holistic than that. And I guess the outcome of all of that would be to say that net gain is really, a net positive impact is an operational focus. Nature positive really isn't. I think nature positive is much more about trying to align processes with a common goal, and having a holistic umbrella consideration of biodiversity and people considerations that you contribute towards, but definitely not something you would have a metric operationally to apply. Following on, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And again, thank you. So one of the issues with the application of net gain for an organisation is, and particularly for offshore wind farms, is that the application generally has happened autonomously by individual organisations, and although we can talk about having a seascape scale approach or developing ecosystem-based outcomes, in many instances there's a lack of control for an individual organisation to be able to drive that, and therefore they're very dependent on kind of the strategic framework that sits around around the seascape in which they're operating. But there's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of frameworks that are being developed. I guess one of the complications for organisations is choosing which framework they're going to apply. But it seems to be a convergence around science-based targets for nature framework, TNFD framework. But most of these frameworks are about how to build a strategy, what to consider, not necessarily about practical application. I think there's still a gap in terms of informing an organisation of how they can practically go about autonomously, independently delivering a net gain approach, especially if there's a lack of a strategic framework for them to work within, and that's a real challenge for organisations. There's a real challenge of translating approaches into the marine environment with all of the inherent complexities. We still don't have appropriate metrics in the marine environment. Even in terrestrial environments, the main metrics are habitat related, habitat hectares related. They don't work very well in the marine environment outside of benthic habitats. And when you're thinking about wide-ranging species and interconnectivity, etc., they don't work at all. The other thing to say is the evidence of the review of marine net gain approaches, which have been carried out quite extensively in some parts of the world, like Australia, is they very often not even achieve no net loss, never mind net gain. So it's incredibly challenging to deliver, and success is low. And restoration is incredibly complex. Even if you were to do nearshore active restoration, seagrass, biogenic reefs, etc., the actual success of restoration may be around 50% in some instances. So it's not a guarantee, which means obviously that part of a good approach for delivering net gain is really focusing on that avoidance part of the mitigation hierarchy. I think one of the problems is that organisations have had to deliver most of their approaches quite autonomously, and we can talk about system-based approaches and we can talk about strategic approaches, but if there's no structure in place, and in many parts of the world there isn't a structure in place to support collaborative, joined up, interconnected approaches, then organisations, although they want to deliver this, they're really isolated in the ability to do that. So the organisations need more support, and I think what's clear from the lessons that we've learned from what's happened over the last 10, 20 years is that strategic collaborative approaches that drive ecosystem-based outcomes are likely to be most beneficial over time. So we need to build those strategic structures. That's happening in the UK. There are other projects happening in East Africa, like the Combio project, the mitigation banking. These approaches will work better, I feel, but they take time to build, they take time to structure, they take time to pull into policy, and we need action now with organisations needing advice. So there's this kind of disconnect between what is necessary and what we know will be more successful, and actually what the conditions that organisations are operating in. Next slide, please. And I'll cut this short because I know I'm running. Next slide, please. I'm running very much past the time. To help with this process at Bluedot, we've developed a new framework, and this is meant to be a guiding framework to support organisations to deliver net gains in a very practical way. And we've looked at state, pressure and response, which is a very archaic kind of model, but it works, and it's founded in a lot of conservation approaches, and it works very well for net gain thinking. I can't go through all of this here, but please go to the website and have a review of this particular approach. The idea is to guide an organisation through the process of determining priorities for actions. So thinking about the state of the environment and what criteria they should use to determine what's a priority for net positive impact approaches, which largely relates to threatened status, I would say, so where an action could lead to a positive outcome. And then once those priority features are defined against criteria, to look at pressures within the system, but not only pressures, because pressures are important for in two aspects. First, for understanding in the offshore environment what you need to do to lead to restoration, because you can't really do too much actively. But also to understand what an organisation can control. We see a lot of advice where we see organisations inform that they should deliver a net positive impact by addressing fisheries, undertaking fisheries management. But actually applying that is very difficult for an individual organisation. It's something that's possibly outside of control. So pressure and control is quite important, and then also looking at site-based impacts related to activities and how to define indicators for those particular activities, and then how does that all lead into determining the right responses through looking at feasibility and looking at outcomes, etc. But I can't talk about all of that because it'll take far too much time, so I will leave it there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aspen Ellis, and I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I work with Dr. Don Kroll there to pursue approaches to achieve net positive impacts specifically for seabirds. So we've been hearing a lot about how to handle this on a larger biodiversity scale. My focus is really narrow. This is less about habitat and more about individual populations and how to improve net positive outcomes for those species. And I also wanted to thank RWI and TNC for hosting me. I'm really excited to be able to have these conversations with you all. We've been working in this space for about 3 years now and recently published a large collaborative project through the National Center of Ecological Analysis and Synthesis to develop a globally applicable framework of best practices for seabird impact assessment and mitigation. And as academics, we want to highlight that our role here is to identify what we think is best from a conservation perspective. And while we're excited to have conversations like these with policymakers, we identify that our framework here may not match well to existing policies depending on the region. Business here, perfect. Okay, so we've seen something like this a number of times today, but from a seabird perspective, of course, we're thinking about the impact to a population. So how that impact, for example, of collision or displacement could impact that population's trajectory over time. And you can imagine this red bar here as any additional collisions or displacement that lead to declines in that population size over a set time period. Our first step to reduce that residual impact is to avoid, primarily through site selection. And then we would move into minimization through approaches like audio or visual deterrence and or curtailment. But then that final step, offsetting, is what we would do both to achieve no net loss and get into the net positive framework. And we emphasize here that this whole mitigation framework is really essential, but that depending on region, there may be significant limitations of both avoidance and mitigation or minimization approaches to actually effectively reduce that residual impact, especially as many of the minimization approaches we know for seabirds are tested with onshore species and onshore environments, and collection of that data to validate those approaches in the marine environment will take valuable time that we may not have as we move forward with these developments. We recognize that with seabirds, offsetting has a particular capacity to boost seabird populations, primarily because this is a taxa where we've got a huge amount of work already done to understand how better we can improve seabird population sizes. So there are existing approaches like translocation of seabird breeding colonies to more biosecure breeding habitats. These are species that typically nest in large island breeding colonies that are free of mammal predators, and typically deal with a number of human impacts, including habitat loss from sea level rise, invasive mammal predation, and then other impacts throughout their non-breeding ranges as well, including fisheries bycatch, and factors like translocation to more biosecure areas, island eradications of those invasive predators, and reduction of bycatch via alterations to fisheries gear or behavior can all be extremely effective at boosting seabird population sizes, especially for colonial nesting species. So a lot of the work that I do is trying to understand how we can use existing modeling tools primarily to take advantage of monitoring work that's been done to better prioritize which species we would need to primarily focus on for offsetting approaches. So we recognize that offsetting can be expensive and these projects have to be prioritized for the species that most need them. And also the research we need to understand more about exactly how much offsetting would need to happen to boost those populations will take a number of resources as well. So being able to prioritize where to focus both that research and then that offsetting is an important concept. So the first step that we would talk about would be exposure as part of vulnerability, and that would be spatial overlap with development areas. And we can use existing modeling approaches like species distribution models based on at-sea and aerial surveys to better understand which species would be primarily overlapping with those zones. If you were looking at low overlap, that immediately would be our lowest criteria for impact and be least concerned about focusing our efforts there. But say that we had a species that was very present in those development zones. We would then want to consider the sensitivity of that species to disturbance. And with seabirds, like I said, that's collision or displacement. So if it was a low sensitivity to collision, we would want to consider if it had a high displacement sensitivity. If it was low both, but was extremely present in those development areas, we would still be concerned, but that's a lower priority. However, if we had either a high collision or displacement sensitivity, and it's typically one or the other, that would kick us into a spot where we would then be concerned about how threatened that population was to begin with as well. So here looking at factors like the IUCN Red List, state or federal listing levels. So if we have a species that is exposed and sensitive, but isn't that threatened, that's a high concern. If we have one that is all three, exposed, sensitive, and threatened, that's a really vulnerable species, and that's where we would want to focus most of our attention. So this can help prioritize, like I said, both research efforts and then also where we would want to focus our offsetting attempts, either towards existing practices that we understood would boost the population or towards researching measures that may boost that population more effectively. Okay. So once we've done that research, we can then use additional modeling tools to focus on those species to better understand the level of impact that we would be expecting to see and how much offsetting would need to happen to counter that impact to achieve net positive for that population. So we can use tools like collision risk models that consider factors like facility size, number of turbines, turbine height, and rotor length, each facility, and combine those with species characteristics, for example, body size, the regional density over months, and flight height. And we can use those to produce outputs of exactly, well, a range of how many individuals we would expect to lose based on collision, at least, over a set time period, so here a year. And what we can then do, because these are broad-ranging species, is consider this from a regional approach and think about how across that whole region, each of those facilities might add up to give us basically a regional output of additional impact for the year. And we can then take those numbers and build them into population viability analysis tools, which is a lot of the work that we do in the lab. So here we're looking at a, do I have my pointer here actually? Yes, I do, perfect. So here we're looking at a existing population today of about 80,000 individuals, and then what that population would be expected to be in 21, 22 under baseline conditions, so in 100 years' time. What we can then do is build in additional impact from offshore wind energy development as based on collision risk models to see how that would affect the population over that same time period, and then compare different management scenarios using that tool. So for example, in that first scenario here, looking at what eradication of one invasive species might mean for one of those breeding colonies, and see that that could entirely counter, in this case, that additional impact from the offshore wind energy development. And we can then also compare which management scenarios would actually be needed to get that population towards an increasing population trajectory over that same time period and be able to compare that against the number of resources that we have available from offshore wind. There's a couple of considerations I want to bring up here. I believe Kate is going to get into a lot more. But with seabirds, these are highly mobile species that are often concentrated at these refined breeding sites, like for the sooty shearwater, these areas in pink in the southern hemisphere. So a species that may be accruing impact in our coastlines, I'm focused on the Pacific, could then primarily be breeding and therefore have the most concentrated important areas for restoration in entirely different regions and often internationally. So we need some framework to be able to use the funding from offshore wind energy impacts to be able to implement conservation action where it will be most effective for those species if we want to do this in a way that is most likely to produce positive outcomes. And in order to do that, like everybody else has been saying, this needs to not be a project-by-project basis. This needs to be pooled, and this needs to be regional. And that's for twofold reasons, really. It's both so that we can fund whole conservation actions, like eradications of whole invasive species at sites, and also so that we can do this in a more precautionary way, especially given the limitations of data that we have available for many of these species. If we want to be able to effectively fund conservation actions that can boost those populations to a level where we think we are achieving no net loss and no net positive, pooling those resources between sites throughout a region is the best way to do that in a way that doesn't burden individual developers. A couple more points to discuss here are that there are a number of species where this framework may be a little bit more challenging to implement. I'm talking mostly about colonial nesting seabird species, but there are a number of birds that will be experiencing impact in these regions where offsetting may be more challenging. For example, in the Pacific coast with Jaegers and skuas, these are species that are highly present in the development areas and have very high collision vulnerability based on flight height, for example, but they're not colonial nesters. They're nesting up in the tundra, and we don't have established conservation metrics that are as easy to point to boost those population sizes. And this is the same, for example, with shorebird species on the East Coast, where it is a little bit less straightforward. And therefore, that framework to prioritize which species are most vulnerable is a good way of understanding where we could focus our efforts, both to better understand impact levels and then also to understand what measures we could actually use to boost those populations. Thank you all. This is a big collaborative project, and if you're lucky enough to have not heard from us yet, I would love to change that at this conference. Happy to chat more after this panel. Thanks.
Hi, Claire. We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Perfect.
Yep. Yeah, I've got the wrong date on my slide, but that's because I'm in the future in early morning in Australia at the moment. So yeah, thanks for having me. At TBC, we work quite a lot with project developers. So we do a lot of project level biodiversity management. And we are starting to see many more requests for more strategic level support and more kind of spatial planning. So this presentation is a little bit of a change of gear because I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about project level considerations. Next slide, please. Don't need to spend too long on this slide, I think. I just wanted to reiterate how important offshore wind is to the energy transition, of course. We all know this really well, especially if you're following GWEC and IEA and all those kind of reports, as I do. Some of the estimates can be a bit hard to grasp. 130 gigawatts of offshore wind expected to be added by 2027. If you're interested in comparisons, there's some in the third bullet there, but estimates sort of suggest that in the US alone in 2022, energy consumption was almost 4,000 gigawatts. All of this obviously has to go hand in hand with tackling nature loss, as Sarah mentioned earlier, which in practice means not making things any worse from a 2020 baseline. It means trying to achieve a positive impact by 2030 and working towards full recovery of nature by 2050 in that order. It's important to know that you can't begin to think more widely until you're confident in having addressed your own project level impacts. So for the next few slides, I'll just try and dip in really quickly to some of the challenges around MPI for offshore wind, thinking about direct project level impacts right now and not so much supply chain stuff. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the mitigation hierarchy, we've heard a lot about this, so don't need to dwell on it for too long, but it is absolutely central to any approach to achieving net positive impact in any sector, in any industry. And it's worth knowing that typically it's both a sequential and an iterative process, so you don't usually optimize the outcomes with just one pass of the mitigation hierarchy. It needs to be based on a quantified impact assessment. You have to at least try to understand your project level impact. If you don't, the chances of demonstrating an MPI are severely diminished. As others have said today already, avoidance is key. It's the best and the most cost effective and the most certain option for for mitigating impacts. And a key tool for that is spatial planning for site selection, and that in itself is a separate symposium topic. We just don't want to develop where biodiversity sensitivity is high. So then in project terms, the next thing is minimisation, which is generally around sensitive construction and operation protocols. Restoration is about making good the areas you've disturbed during construction, for example. And finally, offsets, as we've all said, it's a measure of last resort. It's a means of compensating for significant residual impacts that you couldn't avoid or minimise or restore, but it is a last resort. Next slide, please. So with all that framing in mind, is MPI feasible for offshore wind? Well, obviously there are lots of caveats and we haven't done it yet. And there are loads of efforts underway. So my inclination is to say yes, but with challenges. Offshore wind will most likely be subject to a much higher level of scrutiny than other offshore or even onshore industries have been to date. But the flip side of that, as Melanie said right at the beginning, is that it's an opportunity to do things right, to do things well, and to do things properly. So what do we need to do? Well, we're going to need to identify priorities, and we're talking about a project level at the moment, and there are several ways to do that. They could be conservation priorities, they can be features that are more susceptible to impact, they could be stakeholder priorities, there are lots of things, but there still might be too many features for MPI to be feasible at a project level. So then you have to think about how you refine your objective, and that might be by focusing the MPI goal on features where there is an impact or where there is a significant impact. That's just an example. We've all mentioned metrics. Metrics will be different for priority features and different impacts. So, for example, the number of individuals for bird collisions or the area of habitat for clearance. But it's likely that some of it can be grouped and addressed via proxies, such as when species are linked to a certain habitat, but it's not a given. Sampling and monitoring approaches then, of course, will be different. So to stick with the bird example, visual bird surveys from a vessel pre-construction versus perhaps automated cameras to count collisions during operation. There's a lot going on, and synergies might be possible in terms of data collection throughout, such as multi-platform surveys. But the baseline, again, it must be quantified. Whatever the methods are used, they need to be repeatable and they need to be consistent for the monitoring phase. Efforts to establish the baseline will vary in intensity. They could be quite complex, but they could also be very simple, like a zero baseline for collisions. So then we need to start thinking about what actions can lead to these gains. We have to consider the baseline status and the impact on the priority feature. So if you have a priority feature that isn't impacted, the amount of gain appropriate could be based on expert opinion or on stakeholder consensus. It depends how you set your objective. Some features you can improve, again, as others have said, with actions on site, which is insetting, or you're going to need to look at actions off site, which is offsetting. Next slide, please. And what else is there? Well, uncertainty, of course, that's a fact of life for scientists. Uncertainty for impacts and insets and offsets, but there are some options for handling uncertainty, and it's mainly around transparency, around the confidence that you have. So you can use multipliers for offset targets, you can use conservative upper estimates for impacts and lower estimates of gains, for example. And then there are what we call impossibilities. So it's almost inevitable at any level, I think, that there'll be some of these at the moment. So impacts that you can't quantify in a meaningful way yet, like, for example, changes to a whale migration route because of offshore energy infrastructure. There might be impacts for which it just isn't feasible, there isn't a feasible means of achieving a gain, or for which you just can't agree on an approach. So trading rules, what's equivalent to what, are absolutely essential. And then the challenge of aggregation. What's going to be the process for combining the results from all these individual priority features at the project to determine whether MPI has been achieved for the project? And then there's the same challenge for aggregating all of that from projects across the portfolio to the corporate level. So questions to ask include, do all the features need to be net positive? Could you have some kind of proportion, maybe 80%, for example? Does the magnitude of the impact matter? Should we apply a weighting? Do lots of little impacts weigh against a really big one? It's not clear. But it is clear that you need to establish what can be claimed, and that's essential for credibility and for reporting and disclosure. Next slide, please. So this is a really quick summary, but just to wrap up, this comes from a TBC and IUCN report on project level mitigation for wind and solar. This is just to illustrate how important and influential site selection is to the whole process of achieving MPI. This chart shows a scenario for a low biodiversity sensitivity site. It shows that net gains could be possible through on-site enhancement, on-site or within the project envelope, combined with those sensitive construction and operational protocols I mentioned earlier. Next slide. And if you compare that to this chart, which illustrates a mitigation hierarchy scenario for a project in a high biodiversity sensitivity area, of course, ideally, these areas are avoided altogether through a process of spatial planning. And again, ideally, that's at a strategic or government level. But if these areas are not avoided, then getting a net gain will be much harder. There's going to need to be actions both on-site and off-site, and the chances of then demonstrating a net gain become a lot less certain. And that's why offsets are a measure of last resort, because they're challenging, they're costly, and they're generally quite uncertain, and the timeline is long. So that's just a really brief snapshot of some of the things that we consider at a project level. And obviously there are loads more challenges embedded within all of that. But starting from a base of good practice principles should save time and effort in the long term. And as someone said earlier at the beginning, starting with your conclusions, with your intended outcomes, is really important. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Kate Williams of the Biodiversity Research Institute. Like Aspen, I want to just acknowledge upfront that my focus today is primarily going to be on sort of upper trophic levels, so thinking about fishes, birds, marine mammals, sea turtles. I think when people think about net gain for offshore wind, the first thought is often sort of going to artificial reef effects and biodiversity effects to benthos and lower trophic levels. And it's certainly possible that by creating net biodiversity gain at those lower trophic levels, we could be benefiting upper trophic levels. But in fact, the data indicating those links is actually fairly limited right now. There's a really complex mix of effects on wildlife from different aspects of offshore wind. So things like the presence of the structures themselves, sound, vessel traffic, changes in fishing patterns. All of these things can cause a range of behavioral and other changes that can have both positive and negative consequences, and they can be very difficult to parse. So we need to be thinking, I think, a little bit more broadly, and you heard this from many other speakers today, about environmental net positive impacts, not necessarily biodiversity alone as a metric. And I have a couple points I want to cover quickly, hopefully not repeating too much of what you already heard. First, and these are my personal opinions here, but I think we need to start by acknowledging that there are likely unavoidable impacts for some taxa. In general, when we're trying to minimize effects of offshore wind and wildlife, we go through that mitigation hierarchy, starting with avoiding siting offshore wind away from key habitat areas, and then getting into sort of minimizing and mitigating impacts via things like changing the design of the offshore wind farm or trying to implement deterrents. There are, I would say, highly variable levels of evidence of efficacy for a lot of those methods. And so there are going to be some effects for some wildlife taxa that we can't avoid or minimize or mitigate on site. We don't necessarily know in most cases how serious those effects are, but we have to acknowledge that they are there in order to properly sort of frame this effort to get to net gain. We're going to have to get into to offsets. I'm part of the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative, as is Aspen and many other people here, which is a network of scientists and resource managers where we focus on seabird and waterbird species in the Atlantic. And we're pretty focused on this issue actually right now in relation to offshore wind because there simply aren't methods available to fully eliminate risk to some of these bird species from offshore wind. And many of these populations are also already declining heavily for other reasons. So second, I want to say, and you've heard this again already, science has a really essential role in quantifying impacts. We need to be able to measure the effects of the offshore wind industry as well as the effects of offset activities. And we also need to be able to distinguish offshore wind effects, whether positive or negative, from natural variability, which is very high in the marine environment, as well as from other sources of change, including the effects of climate change on marine systems. And we do, as has been acknowledged already today, need better methods to do this in a lot of cases, both to know what levels of offsets are needed, as well as to be able to mitigate impacts. We need some real investment in research and development for monitoring technologies, as well as mitigation technologies. And something I've been thinking about a lot recently, we need more sort of cross-sector collaboration and communication where, offshore wind developers and regulators are prioritizing wildlife monitoring and then working with the turbine engineers and the developers of wildlife monitoring technologies and the wildlife biologists and the operations and maintenance specialists to really think through how to integrate monitoring capacity into offshore wind farm designs early in the planning process in order to be able to get the information that we need to understand what effects are and how we might be able to mitigate them. Third point I want to make is that net positive impacts for offshore wind, I think, are in a lot of cases going to be off-site and out of kind. So offshore wind causes effects to highly migratory and wide-ranging taxa. They aren't necessarily going to be breeding right near an offshore wind farm, for example. Some of these animals could be spending a lot of their time an entire hemisphere away from the offshore wind farms that they may be interacting with. And that creates some real challenges for measuring environmental loss or gain. Effects may be felt outside of wind farm locations and actually outside of time periods of interactions. So lethal interactions like collisions obviously happen on site, but those are actually relatively uncommon. Most interactions are actually sublethal. So that could be noise exposure. It could be the visual stimulus of a turbine that causes an animal to be displaced from a habitat area right around a wind farm. Those types of effects, if they affect the energetic expenditures of an animal or they affect their ability to take in food, if they're displaced from a good foraging area, those effects could potentially bleed over into other aspects of the life cycle. This is called seasonal interactions. We know it happens in other contexts besides offshore wind. So for example, if a bird doesn't get as much food, due to some disturbance during winter, it could end up going into spring migration and then into breeding in poorer body condition, have lower reproductive success as a result, and have lower fitness. So because these populations and effects can be quite wide-ranging, offsets are almost always going to need to occur away from actual offshore wind farms. There actually generally are not good ways to offset unavoidable impacts to these highly migratory species at the offshore wind farm locations. We're going to need to go to the breeding grounds, the colonies like Aspen said, for example, to try to help improve reproductive success. Or we may be able to go elsewhere to try to really help improve subadult or adult survival to offset effects of offshore wind farms. And there are a variety of opportunities to address these offsite conservation efforts. There are conservation issues in the marine environment like ocean pollution, marine debris, entanglement, fisheries bycatch, creation of breeding habitats. There are a range of opportunities for us with offshore wind to try to pursue these offsite and sometimes out of kind offsets to create net gain for these species. And a quick example from the oil and gas industry, there was a natural resource damage assessment for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And that ended with the creation of a mitigation fund to try to make up for impacts caused by that spill. Substantial numbers of northern gannets were affected by the oil spill. They're a seabird that breeds in Canada. And so one of the focus areas that has been suggested for spending these mitigation funds is testing bycatch reduction measures for northern gannets in association with fisheries in the northeastern US. So there's a situation where there are impacts to a species from a totally different industry, well away geographically from where the impact occurred, but it's the same population. And so if you're addressing fishing bycatch in the northeastern US, you can help support that same population of gannets that were harmed in the Gulf of Mexico. Likewise, there's a lot of tension right now with the fishing industry around efforts to protect North Atlantic right whales and programs to develop or support deployment of ropeless fishing gear that reduce entanglement risk could be an area where funding from offsets could help produce a real impact. And you've heard this again from other folks, but just as I'm wrapping up, I want to put a pitch in here for the importance of sort of third-party funds to help coordinate offset efforts. A group like this, sort of a common mitigation fund, I think was really helpful for the Deepwater Horizon effort, for example, in terms of pulling in experts to help identify potential mitigation approaches, identify which options are likely to be most effective and most cost-effective to help support the populations of interest. And so I think that a common fund that offshore wind developers could pay into would be a really effective way to help support highly migratory and wide-ranging populations that realistically are going to be affected by multiple offshore wind farms throughout their annual cycles. So just in summary, I think there's a real opportunity here for thinking about NPI relative to offshore wind. Thank you very much to the university and the TNC for organizing the workshop. I think this could really help with sort of the large-scale development of the offshore wind industry and with making offshore wind development a win-win for climate and marine wildlife. But we do need to have some clearly defined metrics or potentially no metrics. And we really need scientifically based monitoring to demonstrate efficacy relative to offshore wind effects. And to be most effective, I do think often net positive impact sort of efforts may need to occur away from offshore wind farms and address different types of impacts than those actually posed by offshore wind. And so some kind of common mitigation fund could be really helpful for coordinating those efforts. And thank you very much. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the panel discussion. I've been wondering a little bit about whether we should be thinking about net positive impacts in a regulatory or more of like a voluntary non-regulatory context, and what might be most effective. Once you get into sort of the regulatory context, things can become very constrained, but there's also more accountability sometimes, and I wonder if anyone on the panel wants to weigh in on that.
I'm happy to. Both, I think, is the only way forward. I think because I think well, certainly where I come from, even if you want to do it voluntarily, you still have to get a license to do it. So you still need to be sure that your impact is acceptable. So, but I really think that the voluntary restoration or improvements that have been going on are showing the way. So I think don't wait for regulation to catch up, but work on both. And then, well, at some beautiful point in the future, it'll come together, won't it?
Any other thoughts on that question?
Go on.
Okay.
I think if you're going to go with that kind of dual approach, then it also has to be, goes to the kind of co-creation, co-design thing. I mean, everybody's got to participate in that, whether it's government, whether it's the industry, whether it's the public, and particularly a strong role for the NGOs. Everybody's going to kind of work together on trying to think, what does success look like and how do you make it? And that's not necessarily going to be something that is going to be legislated for or regulated. So that's why I think there is a kind of combination of voluntary and sort of policy guidance, quite a lot of incentives. I mean, I do wonder sometimes whether we can use licensing as a bit more of a carrot rather than a stick for getting better stuff done. Then we certainly, I don't think we do that, or we don't prioritise that in the UK as far as I'm aware. And maybe there should be a bit more kind of like, we will do your processing faster and with more willingness and more enthusiasm if you actually show that you actually want to do the right thing.
Are there any other questions that the speakers would like to ask of one another? And
I've got one. I'm curious about Sarah saying that we should have, nature positive, should be positive biodiversity and positive social, but they should be kept separate, because I really believe that unless we start to bring society and ecology together, we're not going to get faster, better outcomes.
That's a good question. I was thinking of that primarily in terms of how we celebrate what's done. So I was thinking about how there could be a situation where an installation did great damage to the pelagic ecosystem and yet created many jobs, and said, we are being biodiversity positive because we are being socially responsible. And I felt like those things should go on different ledger sheets, because you can't replace ecological damage with a lot of happy workers. So that was the case I was really kind of thinking of there, but I do agree with you that a greater attention to that inseparability of the social and ecological systems is warranted across the board.
Yeah, it sort of brought me back to the kind of frameworks we have. And I think, there are different frameworks in every country where you've got different ways of looking at, like, sort of, what's the site you're going to put this in? What's the economic benefit? That whole impact assessment, which should not just be ecological, but it should all be social. But how do you weight? I mean, is it one out, all out? If we're not hitting on the societal benefit, this shouldn't go ahead. If we're not hitting on the ecological benefit, this shouldn't go ahead. Well, the example you described is something that actually we allow something to go ahead because it has societal benefit, but doesn't actually have any ecological benefit at all.
Right, and I get that this is thorny stuff. I'm thinking about another area that I'm working in entirely, where we're talking about whether social considerations should be a gating mechanism, where it's like, if there's no social benefit, this activity shouldn't go forward, absent what it might do in the environment. So perhaps think about, the social benefits as like gating mechanisms, or the ecological outcomes as gating mechanisms, rather than like dual objectives to be hit at the same time, I guess, because they do operate in different spheres. So yeah, and this gets into something that I think you brought up where, how do we quantify these things? The simple numbers doesn't really do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge body of social science out there that we don't use in these kind of discussions that actually can contribute to sort of trying to get that valuation. Can actually, social science is hugely quantitative.
Right. As
is ecology. So why don't, we just need to embrace some of that kind of, I think we can get metrics, but they will be complicated and time consuming. We have a question. Oh.
Okay. Oh. Yes. Conversation. Sure. That's okay. Claire or Neil, do you have any questions you would like to pose to folks?
Not question. We're finding it very, very hard to hear. I'm sorry. But we're picking up some of the conversation. I think the thing about regulatory or voluntary approach to the question before, I mean, this really comes down to evidence of what we've seen through the kind of carrot and stick approach. And when you have requirements to deliver a net gain, then generally there's at least an attempt to do so. When there aren't requirements, then that might not happen. But actually, the best outcomes we tend to see relate to much more of a voluntary intent to do the right thing and to try to go beyond what a regulatory requirement may be, and that would be normally the philosophy or the ethos of the organisation that's actually trying to drive the approach and trying to do something that goes beyond the minimum essentially.
I think you froze there. Yeah. Claire, do you have any questions that you wanted to raise with the group? Can you not hear me? Claire?
I'm finding it quite difficult to hear the discussion actually, but
Okay.
I can hear Neil fine. So I'd echo what he's just said about some of the best outcomes we see as consultants comes from a voluntary effort on the part of the developers, but they are increasingly overwhelmed by where to begin and the whole issue of metrics and all this confusion in terms of jargon and lingo and definitions, and that becomes even harder when they're international global developers working in lots of different regulatory regimes, and that becomes their benchmark, their minimum, and then anything above that can mean completely different things in different markets. So I mean, I don't have an answer to that challenge, but that's part of the issue with how to claim net gain. Mm-hmm. How do you know when you've done it? And how do you sort of standardize that across a portfolio? Super hard.
Yeah, I would just, from the viewpoint of a conservation organization, that actually we do compensatory mitigation, the Nature Conservancy does. Companies come to us to work with them on delivering restoration projects as compensation. When there's not a metric in place, it's very, very difficult for us. We can't give companies the ability to claim that what they're doing is mitigation if they can't quantify it at all, because then we kind of can be easily accused of it being kind of just greenwashing. So yeah, it is then viewed kind of more as a contribution, a voluntary contribution to conservation than mitigation. And some conservation organizations will make that distinction very clear and feel very uncomfortable unless there's some quantification behind it if a company is going to make the claim that this is an actual offset.
So I think we're getting, I'm going to try and go closer to this. I think it's going to be really loud in here. But hopefully the guys over there can hear. I think we're confusing, I mean, I think Aisling and I are not saying we don't need to collect data. We do need to collect data because, you need to know if the intervention you've made is having an effect. I think what we're worried about, I mean, certainly in the UK we have the biodiversity net gain metric, which is set out. You will do this. You will follow these steps. You will quantify these things. each of them will be added up together. You will have some sort of stacking process. On the basis of this, you will be paid this amount for however much percentage you reach. That, to me, seems to be the kind of, in the marine world, I have to use my words carefully here, in the marine world, I think that is going to be the pathway of madness, because I don't think we're ever going to kind of really be able to set up these like-for-like equivalent metrics that can be used and applied in every single marine habitat or marine situation and do it effectively. I think it's just going to be really difficult. And that's what I'm against when I talk about metrics. Not collecting data and saying, at the beginning, there was this much of this, and over the time, we can see that that has or hasn't changed. We do have to do evaluation.
I think
Yeah, go ahead, and then I think we'll turn
one
to
of-
questions to the audience. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with that kind of approach, and I completely agree, I think the one thing that has held back the delivery of marine net gains is the ability to measure the loss and then also to define an appropriate metric to define the gain. Problem, and I think it can be addressed through taking maximized approaches to deliver ecosystem-based, broad ecosystem-based approaches that link together and ensure that you have a positive outcome. And I think that's where things are moving, and that's great. But from a developer perspective, particularly if they're trying to meet requirements, they need to deliver a net gain. Net is measurable, right? So to deliver a net gain, they need to measure a gain against the loss, and they need to demonstrate that they're delivering that gain. So without any measurements at all, it's very difficult for them to do that. And this is normally why they would, the paradigm is that a developer would normally take an approach of least resistance. They would normally take an approach where they can most easily define where and measure where their net gain can be shown. But that's not necessarily the right approach in the marine environment for defining a good outcome. And that's where we seem to be stuck. We seem to be stuck somewhere between what's practical and sensible to meet regulatory requirements or IFC requirements to demonstrate that you are doing something measurable, and it definitely is having a positive outcome, to taking broader approaches that are not driven by metrics, but take the right approach to deliver an ecosystem-based benefit that will connect together and be for multiple habitats and for multiple species connected to those habitats. But we need to break some paradigms to get there. We need to break paradigms of like for like. We need to break paradigms of equivalence. We need to break paradigms of measurability against particular losses. And the way we deal with that is by just being honest about the losses. We say we actually cannot measure the losses in this situation. So therefore, it's very difficult for us to then define a measurable gain for you related to those losses. But this is a system-based approach that you can adopt that will lead to a definite gain. But again, even defining those definite gains, as I didn't really get into this too much earlier, you're thinking where the biggest pressures are from a seascape perspective, from a system-based perspective. An individual organisation probably cannot exert too much influence over those pressures. They may be able to do some nearshore restoration, they may be able to do some multi-habitat restoration, but it may not be possible to address fisheries issues. It may not be possible to address navigation issues. It may not be possible to deal with the ship strikes associated with that and underwater sound, etc. And this is the problem in the marine environment, because the big system-based pressures are not necessarily controllable by an individual organisation. So they go for the easy option to demonstrate the net gain. And yeah, this is the problem we've seen for 10 years, and it needs to be somehow addressed. And I think strategic approaches help that, but strategic approaches are not present everywhere. They're being developed in the UK, But in many of the places we operate in the developing world, the governance structures aren't there to support those kind of approaches.
Neil Ashling is very eager to respond, but let me just first, if folks from the audience have questions, if you can, okay, just so that the folks who are helping us out with mics can start bringing them. Ashling.
Well, I mean, Neil just said it right there at the end, I think, and it's, this is why I think the burden needs to be collective. We all need to take the responsibility. You can't give it just to the developers because, as you've just said, we won't be able to they won't be able to deliver it, and we won't be able to figure out whether it's good enough or not. So we all need to accept the responsibility, and we need to use big priorities and big areas of focus that we can see a change in over relatively short periods of time. That's what I really feel strongly has to happen. I understand that not everybody has the governance or the institutional governance to deal with that, but I think those of us that do need to get on with it and set that example yesterday, you know, like not in 10 years.
So I'm Jamie Lashinsky. I work for Boskalis. Probably not a household name. We're maritime contractors, so we build the offshore wind farms. We're in the US. This is just starting here. Like most of the experience from the panel right now is the experience of a decade of building offshore wind farms and offshore maritime structures in a modern governance environment from Northwest Europe. Like, that's just not here yet in the States. Like, it is definitely not here in the Eastern Seaboard. It's just starting. It's like the first steps. It's the first piece of it. And it would be awesome to start it right. So what you guys are saying, like, don't restart from the beginning. You know, start where the rest of other industries have already figured it out and bring it in. But if you had to make one recommendation to the US governmental agencies of how to start today, what is it? Just one. That's all.
Thank you. I'm going to ask folks to try and keep their responses short so that we can hear from multiple of our panel members. So,
4 words. Natural capital ecosystem service approach.
okay.
Set up a bank account to receive the money now. You probably already know what you want to spend it on, so just start it now.
Thank you. Sarah, any
Going
thoughts?
down the line. Plan for climate change, because it's also going to be a problem.
I think just set up some kind of system to be able to regulate this on a regional scale that effectively rewards industry for engaging in these actions so that we can make it happen.
Nice.
Say some kind of working group to continue these discussions and bring in expertise from around the world to inform where the money gets spent, for example, as it's coming into the new bank account would be, I think, really helpful.
Claire?
Yeah, all of the above, but also I think they've got to bring it right back to basics and make sure that the things like EIA are really fit for purpose and done really well, and bring in some of the issues around cumulative impact assessment, which is bolted on more often than not.
Mm-hmm. And Neil?
Define the scale of the assessment and where you're operating, and determine the priorities that organizations can focus upon.
Thank you. And your name and affiliation?
Yes, Laura Stone, World Wildlife Fund. And so I'm going to build off of that question because it's such a great one. So trying to learn from other industries and trying to get this right early. Everybody was sort of in one way or another talking about data. I feel like I can't go to a conference without talking about data, whether it's a lack of it or just so much of it that we get bogged down in it. And even thinking about down the line when we have to monitor some of these, commitments and things that we're putting out. I'm just curious if anybody has seen application of AI or machine learning, and whether or not that's hit this, similar to how like the fishing industry has started to work with electronic monitoring and that fishing sector kind of application, and whether or not we're thinking about AI yet in this.
So of the speakers, is there anyone who has thoughts on this matter? Go ahead.
I mean, just as an example, a lot of types of monitoring technology bring in huge amounts of data, whether it's acoustic data or video, imagery, photographs, and rather than manually reviewing all of that and identifying the species that are being detected, there are a variety of efforts to try to automate those processes. So maybe it's trying to detect when you hear a bat echolocation call on a sonogram, or maybe it's trying to automatically actually identify that call to species. Those are different processes and wildly varying levels of difficulty often. But there are a bunch of efforts to do this actually. For example, BOEM has been working with Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Survey to develop AI for digital aerial surveys. So these are surveys that are conducted by putting cameras on planes, so you don't, traditional wildlife surveys, you typically have to fly really low altitudes, and so they can be actually super dangerous, particularly for like seabirds. You can fly a little higher for marine mammals because they're bigger, but traditionally they have been an extremely dangerous thing to do and not super practical to do way offshore. Digital aerial surveys, you can actually fly much higher. You have super high definition cameras in the planes, but then you have terabytes and terabytes of imagery that you need to go through, and it can be prohibitively expensive. And so BOEM, among others, have been trying to develop sort of automated algorithms to both detect and then also hopefully eventually identify species in these detections, so that we can come up with a system that is safer and also a lot more efficient.
Thank you. I think Mel has a response, and then I think there's one other question. That might be our last question.
Just, I know that people are doing that with benthic monitoring as well. I mean, you're absolutely right in monitoring, deep sea monitoring, where you've just got reams and reams of video, then it's the way forward to actually analyze that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caleb Spiegel. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and my question is goes back to an early question that I think one of the panelists asked the other panelists about regulatory versus voluntary. And I think the answer was co-creation and co-design, which I think is a pretty cool idea. But in the issue is, I think a lot of people maybe are waiting for this kind of partnership to develop. And I was curious to know whether or not folks on the panel have any thoughts about how to get that co-creation, co-design kind of going, where it's not waiting for the regulatory environment to actually move it forward. Because I think, I work for an agency, and I think we see that sometimes agencies are a little slow in getting things going. So anyway, I just was wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that, how to get started.
That's you, actually.
There are fantastic conveners out there already. They're just waiting for us to give them the mandate to do it, I think. I say that as a government agency. We've learned really clearly that actually in most cases it's not our skill. There are people that are way better at it than us. The Nature Conservancy, maybe, I mean, that's on a large scale, but in the UK we have what are called coastal partnerships, and we've just begun to work much more closely with them because they already convene and bring people together. We're just kind of pointing them in the direction of the things we would like them to discuss, or the things we would like them to invite us in to talk about. So I think you have to be open to finding those groups and trusting them, because they already exist and they're already trusted. So that can really help you. This is a pet topic of mine, so I'd be really happy to talk more about it.
So now the last word.
Okay, I worked
all
with.
of a sudden the numbers are in red in front of
Okay, I worked with Aisling on one of these co-creation kind of co-development projects. There's two things that help. I mean, if we're going to open a big bank account for trying to get net positive impact, it would be really useful to use some of that to actually help things along, because we did it on a shoestring in the UK. The other one is just curiously, I think academics, you know, we're in the law school, we're in the university here. Academics are really good independent brokers of these things because people can get really polarized in their kind of opinions. And you know, no disrespect, that also includes the NGOs, it includes the industry, it includes all sorts of people, the publics. And somehow, bizarrely, academics are often viewed as sort of independent arbitrators. And we have to keep that. You know, we came here, and Julia said, we're here as can't remember the word you used, non-advocacy or something like that. And that's what academics have to try and keep that space, I think, in these circumstances.